Learning how to use a camera for the first time can be daunting. What do all those settings, buttons, modes, symbols, what do they even mean and how they affect your image? Can't I just use auto mode and have the camera do the work for me? Well, no, not really. You kind of got to understand what the camera's doing and how it works. So today, let's dive into camera settings. So looking at this camera, this is a Sony a7 III, and I know that every camera is going to be different. Everybody's kind of got their own taste and their own style, so you really just have to familiarize yourself with the body. But a lot of the icons and a lot of the buttons are the same, and they mean the same thing across camera manufacturers. So you have your mode dial, which is consistent with most all cameras. They all have this dial on it. And then you just have different function buttons, just different customizability buttons. And then that's typically something you can customize. Each camera manufacturer lets you kind of change it up the way you want it. You have your movie record button, your shutter button. Obviously the lens has its own functions and features, which we can talk about in a minute. But then custom buttons here, exposure, compensation. You just have to familiarize yourself with your own camera body. I can't really go into too many specifics about this one in particular because I realize most of you probably don't even have this camera. But what I can do is show you kind of the modes and the functions on the wheel here and explain how they work. You want to take it off of auto. That's just a mode that we don't really want to use. We'll put it on manual, right? That gives us control over everything on the camera. People usually give you flack if you use your camera in auto, but the question is why? Why is that such a big deal? Why can't I just use auto? Isn't it super good? Like, the camera technology is pretty decent. And yeah, while that is true, it is pretty good at a lot of things. It takes away a lot of the creativity that goes into photography and videography. If you can't control what your camera is looking at or doing, then what's the point? You might as well just use a phone camera. You might as well just not even have a professional grade camera if you don't even want to put the care and the effort into your shot. So using it on auto, while it can work and does usually take pretty decent photos, a lot of times there are many circumstances. So like filming in the studio, I can't leave my camera on auto because the settings would change. If the light changes or if the focus changes, it just drastically throws off your image and it doesn't give you a consistent look if you're filming. And then same thing with photos. You're kind of fighting the camera and your photos may come out different than what you want them to. So for that reason, auto is just not really, you're just kind of defeating yourself at that point. So you want to switch it to something more usable, and we'll talk about that now. To really kind of understand how your camera settings work, we got to talk about the camera triangle. And the camera triangle consists of your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Your aperture is the size of the little pinhole inside the lens. It gets bigger or smaller and lets in a certain amount of light. So your image will get brighter or darker. This is also how you can control that bokeh effect. If you want your background to be blurry while your subject is in focus, or if you want pretty much everything to be in focus, that's what this aperture controls by letting in a certain amount of light. So that's the first stop on the exposure triangle. And then you have your shutter speed. That's your shutter here inside the camera, and that's what actually closes and captures the image and captures the light. And depending on how fast you have that set, you'll either get a blurry image or a darker image. So if it's super fast, if it's a high shutter speed, meaning it's like capturing super quickly and not even letting all the light in, you're gonna get a darker image. This is good if you are outside in like a bright sunny day and there's a sporting event and there's people running really fast and you wanna get like crisp photos and you don't wanna have motion blur. It'll just capture a quicker photo. You need plenty of light for this simply because of how quick it's capturing, but it gives you no blur. Or you can turn it down really low and have a low shutter speed and it will capture blur. So you can do long exposure photography like nighttime where it stays open and lets all the light hit the sensor and then it shuts it off and closes it. So the more light you have hitting the sensor, the brighter your image is going to get, the more it picks up. So that's why nighttime photography, a low shutter speed to just keep that shutter open and let your sensor absorb all that light and then close it. And then that's how you can see stars and more darker objects. This also works if you want to do like waterfall photography, like a long exposure. And that's really not they say long exposure, but it's really just leaving your shutter open for like a half a second or less, so that you can kind of get like a motion blur effect within your photo while still not blowing out your image. So that's shutter speed. There's really a lot of cool things you can do with your shutter speed, and you kind of got to mess around with it to get a feel for it. And then the last stop on the exposure triangle is the ISO, and that's just your basic light compensation. If you're between your shutter speed and your aperture, if you have those dialed in just right, but it's still too dark and you can't get any kind of extra lighting, then it's basically your camera compensating and just brightening the image, brightening the composition. And then same thing with this exposure compensation dial on the Sony. It's kind of it works in a similar way. But your ISO is just basically your light function. And that's something you either want to keep on auto, which I usually do, or keep it really low. Because if your ISO is too high, it will make your image look super grainy and super noisy, and it's actually going to look really bad. So the lower your ISO is, the cleaner and sharper your image is, because your camera is not doing any extra processing to the image. But that may not always work out for you depending on your environment. You may need to bump it up just a little bit. So I try to stay below 400 ISO if I can. And I mean, the cameras go all the way up to 10,000, 100,000 plus. So it's just the lower ISO you have, the cleaner the image. So that's the exposure triangle. And the idea is that on manual mode, you get full control over everything in your camera, all three of those elements. And you know that it takes into account white balance, which basically changes the color temperature of your image so it doesn't look super blue or super orange or super green. You can kind of change the color temperature a little bit to make it a little more accurate, make it easy when you're editing later. But that's not as big of a deal. White balance can usually just stay on auto if you're taking photos, or if you're doing video, you can just set the color temperature and then forget about it. But really what you want to do is you want to have control of those three elements in the exposure triangle: your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. This manual mode gives you control over all three. So in a studio environment like I'm in right now, this is a great mode to be in. I have the time to kind of think about what I want to do. I'm setting up my camera on a tripod. Nothing's really moving. I can dial my settings in real nice, and it's perfect for that. I can get full control out of the creativity in the camera. The second mode on this dial, so there's a mode, and this is actually my favorite mode. This is not auto. Auto's over here, but this is Aperture Priority mode, which simply means your camera does everything automatic except for that aperture. It gives you aperture control. And I honestly shoot with this more than anything else. So it will give you automatic shutter speed based on your lighting and your environment. It'll give you automatic ISO, but manual control over your aperture. So you can control how deep you want your image to be. You can control kind of the amount of light it's letting in, your focus range, your area. So that is a great mode if you're doing something like street photography, or if you're just out and about and like, you know, you're going from light to dark and your environment is constantly changing. Just throw it on aperture priority. Then all you have to do is worry about one setting, and the rest of your camera will compensate and figure it out based on that one setting. It's kind of a general rule of thumb that you want to have control over at least one element of your camera triangle. If you give up control of all three to the camera by throwing it on auto mode, then you kind of just really lose creative ability, and your camera is really just taking that over, and you're not really getting the full potential out of your camera that you could be. So as long as you can control one of those elements, then you're kind of telling your camera what to do instead of just letting it pick up whatever it wants. So aperture priority is honestly my favorite for most situations. And then this S is shutter priority mode. So that controls everything automatically except for your shutter speed, which is great if you're at like a sporting event or something and you really want to capture fast motion and you don't want it to be too blurry. You don't want your photos to, you know, be too out of focus. You really want to focus on like kind of the motion in what's happening. Turn on your shutter speed and then set it to a higher mode so that it'll capture that crisp image without much blur, and then your camera will automatically compensate the rest of the settings to give you a good looking image. So that's also a really great mode. Like I said, so just general rule of thumb, full manual is for use in studios, and then I usually use the aperture or the shutter priority if I'm out and about taking pictures and I don't have to worry about some basic settings that I just shouldn't have to. So those are the three main settings that are on every single camera. On this dial, there's also a P, which is program, which basically means you can turn it on and then go through the camera settings and kind of just program it the way you want it to. It's a safe programming mode. These 1 and 2 are custom settings. So right now I'll turn my camera on and show you kind of how it's set up, and we'll go through some examples here. So if I go into manual mode, I'll flip my screen up so you can kind of see it a bit. If I go into full manual mode, take a picture of that. I have control over everything, and I have my camera set up in a custom way that makes sense to me. So your camera may be a little different, like I say, but here I'm controlling my aperture, and that's this number down here. You can kind of see if I go with a smaller aperture, it gets darker. The little pinhole at the front of the camera is getting really tiny, and it's letting in less light, so it's darker. So that means everything would pretty much be in focus. If this was like a mountain scene or something, I would have focus over everything and there wouldn't be much blur. I like to keep it mostly wide open, which means it's letting in the maximum amount of light, which means the image gets lighter, but your focus area is greatly fine-tuned, so you're going to have a lot of blur in the background. And it's hard to tell with this because there's just a wall behind it, but whatever's behind your subject would be blurry in this instance. So that is your aperture. Next is the shutter speed, which is this, and it's measured in increments of a second. So that's like 1/15 of a second, because when you think about it, it's just moving so fast, you have to measure it in terms of how many seconds does it take to close. So if you go do it really high, it's gonna open and close so fast, it's not gonna let in any light. It's just a dark image. So you kind of got to put it just low enough where we can get a nice even light on that and take a better photo. But the problem is, you can kind of see my hand in front of it. If I do it too low, it lets in lots of light, but it does not pick up motion so good. So if I kind of put it really low and compensate with my aperture, it just looks blurry. My hand looks blurry because it's capturing it slower. So that's, like I say, if you want to do long exposure stuff, this is a great mode where you kind of press the shutter button and let the movement happen, and it creates like a motion blur. So you can do some really cool stuff with it, but in a studio, if you're filming or something, this is just not a great mode because everything just turns out really blurry. So that's the shutter speed. You kind of want to just balance that in a way that looks natural, but still gives you enough light with your aperture. So if I did my aperture wide open and my shutter speed right about there, I can then have a decent looking image without even having to touch my ISO, which I have set to here. So now we'll get into the ISO. If I click into it, it's set at 100. And like I said, the lower the ISO, the cleaner and sharper your image is. So I try to keep it at 100, as much as I can, so that I know that my ISO is as low as it'll possibly go. And if I can get these two settings, my shutter speed and my aperture, dialed in, it's going to be a clear image. But I know that if these are dialed in where I want them to be and it's still too dark, then I'm usually in a dark room and I have to bump up that ISO just a little bit. And I try not to go above 400 because it starts to get grainy. But this camera goes all the way up to like 200,000 or something. Super crazy. Or you can just put it on auto, in which case it'll compensate. So it'll give you an auto ISO based on the readings of the camera. That's one that, depending on the situation, if I'm out and about shooting street photography or whatever, auto ISO works pretty well. So that's full manual mode. Those are really the three elements you can control if you're in a studio. And then that one final component is white balance. So that's this button here for me. And what that does, I usually just leave it on auto. So that just changes the look of your image. See, that's like, this is compensating for daylight. So if I was outside, it adds a lot of orange to counteract the blue sky, the blue sunlight. Same thing for if I'm outside in the shade, it adds just an extra layer of orange. If it's cloudy out, if I'm under incandescent light bulbs, which are typically orange, it makes the image blue to balance that out. And then fluorescent, like there's just so many options. And then I can do underwater, or I can just set the Kelvin temperature under some custom settings. But typically the presets are pretty decent to know and understand what you want. But like I said, this I usually just leave on auto 90% of the time because it's just gonna compensate no matter what. Unless I'm videoing and filming, I usually just leave it on auto. So those are the four elements that you need to kind of really understand on your camera. And every camera has these settings. Every camera, I don't care if it's $50 or $5,000. This is all a camera does, just these three things. And all these extra knobs and buttons just give you easy access and functionality to these settings to help make your image better, to kind of enhance it a bit. So that's full manual mode. If I go into Aperture Priority, which is my favorite mode, you'll see that I can only control my aperture, which is that number there, the orange. This is normally my shutter speed button, but since it's in Aperture Priority, and you can kind of see my shutter speed is compensating, so it's gonna automatically give me the best looking image. And if as I change my aperture, my shutter speed is also moving to compensate for that. And my ISO I have set to 100, so if I bump that to auto, now 2 of the 3 elements are on auto mode, but I'm still retaining the 1, which is the aperture. And as I change that, it's just going to compensate with the ISO, which I'm not a fan of. I prefer that it compensate with the shutter speed in a situation like this. As you can see, the shutter speed isn't even moving, and so it's just going to darken it based on the ISO. So I like to leave that at 100. So I really have 2 elements that are custom and then 1 that's auto, and then there my shutter speed's changing. So that's really how that works. Like I said, it's just an easy way. If I want a blurry background in a photo, I can just flip it all the way wide open, take the shot, or then if I need to change to do something where I want everything in focus, I can just flip over 1 setting, take the shot. Shutter speed is way slow. That's why it's taking a second. And then it compensates, but then you still end up getting the same kind of image out of it. So that's Aperture Priority. I'll put that back to normal. Shutter speed priority is the same thing like you would imagine. You're just adjusting your shutter speed, and then everything else compensates. So if I want a super fast shutter speed, it's going to compensate as best it can, but unless I have my ISO in auto, it'll compensate for the image there. So this will be a super fast image. So that's like if we're at a sporting event and I want to capture somebody running without getting them all blurry, I'll just turn that up super high, turn your ISO on auto, and then your camera will compensate and give you a better looking image. And then same thing, if I want it really low and I want that nice motion blur, I can just turn it low and it stays open. So it takes a second longer to take the photo because it stays wide open to capture more light, but it still gives me that good image. So those are really kind of the 3 main modes that you kind of got to play around with to really get to know your camera. Like I said, I like Aperture Priority the best if I'm just out and about, but then manual for everything else. And then, like I said, these 1 and 2 are custom modes. So these I have set for video more. So that's like if I'm shooting 4K video at 24 frames per second, or 4K, or I'm sorry, this is 1080 at 120 frames per second. So super slow motion. And then video settings are the same but different as photography. So photography settings, the exposure triangle, all 3 of those things, okay, they make sense. Video takes all those things into account as well. So if we go into a video mode here, we kind of have the same thing. We have our aperture, and that's just changing the amount of light you have coming in. You may hear your aperture referred to as an f-stop more frequently. I keep calling it aperture, but f-stop is also another term for it. You set your shutter speed, and this is going to be really blurry and really slow because it's kind of dark in here. So I know I have my aperture wide open. That's what I want. And I got to get my shutter speed to be just quick enough where it's not picking up a lot of motion blur. So like that looks good, but it's really dark. So then I'll go in and change my ISO. I'll just bump it up to like 500 or something, 400, 500. That looks pretty good. It looks a little orange, so I can go in, change my white balance. I like to keep it on manual. I do everything manual if I can for video, because it just looks really weird if you're videoing and then your picture starts to change color, or just like the camera's compensating for something when you're videoing. So it's just easier to do everything manual. So I mean, that underwater auto looks pretty good. The blue, it makes it think it's underwater. So there, I mean, the same thing. Your same settings apply whether you're videoing or filming. You just hit either record or take the shutter, take the picture with the shutter button. But that's really it. Those are your main settings. Once you kind of figure out how to balance those and what buttons do what on your camera, then you can really figure out your image and then know how each of those settings affects your image. A couple more quick things I'll give you a rundown on to give you just a better head start when you start with your camera. If your camera has the ability to, you should always shoot in RAW photos. And that is in my settings here under file format. So you can either do JPEG or RAW. What that means is a JPEG is going to be like any photo you look at on your phone, pretty much everything out there on the internet. Like that's just a file type. It's a JPEG photo. It's the internet's way of saying this is a picture in computer speak. And that is usually just a low resolution compressed image that just displays basic color, and it's small enough to be able to like send an email or stream or download. It's not a huge image file that that would take forever to pull up on your phone. A RAW is the opposite of that. So RAW means it captures everything it possibly can to give you full control over editing. So if you're really trying to take photos and edit them to be something great, then RAW is the way to go. And so for a good example of this is if you turned your camera on to JPEG and you went outside, pointed your camera up at the sky and like took a picture, it's probably going to be pretty white. Like it's just going to be all blown out. On a JPEG image, you won't have much control. You can throw your camera into an editor and it's just going to be pretty white. It doesn't retain a lot of information. But a RAW, and I'm always surprised at this, a RAW captures so much color that you don't see. So if you go outside and take the photo just RAW, it may appear the same, it may just appear white, but once you start kind of playing with your color sliders, you'll realize there's color hidden underneath some of the exposure, and it captures more information than it just displays on the screen here. So there's kind of layers and layers of information within the picture. As a result, they're much larger file sizes, but you just get so much better looking photos out of a RAW image than JPEG. So that's why you'd want to use that. And then a real quick final note on videoing is your frame rate. So you might have seen earlier this setting that I have, this custom setting is at 4K at 24p. Well, what the heck does that mean? So if we go into our settings here, and I did a video on frame rate, but I'll spare you the time and just explain it really quick here. This is your frames per second, so how many times it's capturing an image. 24 frames per second is considered more cinematic. That's what movies are shot in. 30 frames per second is what TV shows are shot in. You could also do that for like YouTube or internet stuff. I usually just film in 24 all the time. So that's just a good setting to leave it at. And if you switch it to 120 frames per second, this is actually slow motion. And it's not slow motion when you're filming, it's slow motion when you're in post-production. So if you just film at 120 frames per second and then your video is in 120 frames per second, then it's gonna look like it's kind of sped up and it's not gonna look natural. It's meant to, if you're gonna film in a frame rate that high, you're supposed to pull it into an editor and then use it, and convert it to a lower frame rate later, and then just gives you the option for slow motion if you want it later. But like I said, I explain all that in my frame rate video, which I'll link kind of up at the top in the card, and give you a better idea of how that works. So that's really it. Every camera has the same settings. They all do the same thing, but they just do it in a different way. So once you kind of figure out how your camera operates and how it does those things, then you at least understand how those settings are affecting your image quality and how to get a better image. So thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give me a sub, a like, a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.